What happened to you in high school that completely destroyed your reputation? I was sitting in detention with no way to contact anyone, while my diabetic younger brother was stuck at home alone with our alcoholic father who'd already passed out by 3 p.m. Just 2 hours earlier, I'd been working on a chemistry lab when Jessica beside me mentioned she needed help with her Twitch stream setup. I figured I'd be nice and wrote down my username to help her with the technical stuff. That's when Marcus, sitting behind us, went completely white and started hyperventilating. He stumbled to the nurse's office where we could hear him having what sounded like a panic attack. When he came back 20 minutes later, his hands were still shaking as he pointed at my paper and whispered, "You're Tech Wizard 2019. I said, "Yeah, that's my Twitch handle." I asked if he wanted to check out my streams sometime, but he just stared at me like I'd threatened his family. Then he packed up his stuff and literally sprinted out of the classroom. An hour later, I got called to Assistant Principal Davis's office where she was waiting with Principal Thompson and Mr. Rodriguez, the school counselor. They had screenshots printed out covering the entire conference table. Davis's face was stone cold as she said, "We have evidence of cyberbullying, doxing, and coordinated harassment campaigns." I looked at the papers and my stomach dropped. Screenshot after screenshot of Twitch messages from TechWizard 2019 saying things like, "I know where Marcus lives. His family won't be safe much longer. I'm coming for you." The messages were dated over the last 3 months. "That's not me," I said immediately. "Someone else must have that username." But Principal Thompson slammed his hand on the desk. "Marcus identified you in class. You admitted it yourself." I tried explaining that Twitch usernames aren't unique across all platforms, that thousands of people could have similar handles, but Davis cut me off. "These messages reference our school specifically, Marcus's schedule, his route home from band practice. You're telling me that's a coincidence?" I'd literally never spoken to Marcus before today. I didn't even know he existed until chemistry class. But Thompson pulled up worse screenshots showing messages that said, "Your little sister Emma, better watch her back. I know she walks alone after cheerleading practice." The messages knew details about Marcus's family that I'd never heard of. I said I didn't even know Marcus had a sister. But Rodriguez leaned forward and said, "That's exactly what someone trying to cover their tracks would say." I looked at the clock and my heart started racing. It was 2:45 and school ended at 3:15. If I wasn't home by 3:30, my 12-year-old brother Tyler would be alone with Dad, who'd been drinking since noon. Tyler had type 1 diabetes and needed his insulin injection at 4 p.m., but Dad was usually too drunk to help by then. "I need to get home to my brother," I said. "He has diabetes and needs his medication." But Davis blocked the door. "You're not going anywhere until we get to the bottom of this." She was already dialing the police. "We have a clear threat to student safety." Police? For something I didn't do. I explained that Tyler was only 12 and couldn't manage his insulin alone when Dad was drinking. But Thompson said, "You should have thought about your brother before terrorizing innocent students." Of course, blame the victim. I was getting desperate as the clock hit 3, I kept out. Tyler would be walking out of middle school right now, expecting me to pick him up like always. When I didn't show, he'd take the bus home to find Dad passed out on the couch. Tyler wasn't old enough to calculate his insulin dosage correctly, especially when he was scared and alone. Check my Twitch account, I pleaded. "I've been streaming since 2019. You can see my content history." But Rodriguez laughed. "Multiple accounts. Classic cyberbully behavior." They showed me more screenshots where the harasser called Marcus both his real name and Mark in different messages, which made no sense if it was really me. But Davis said, "You're using different names to confuse him psychologically." I kept staring at the clock. 3:15 now. Tyler would be getting on the bus, worried about why I wasn't there. He'd be home in 20 minutes to find Dad unconscious in the living room. Tyler knew how to use his glucose meter, but calculating insulin was complicated math that stressed him out even when I was there to help. "Please, just one phone call to arrange someone to help Tyler," I begged. But Thompson said, "Criminals don't get special privileges." Davis pulled up more evidence showing the harassment messages came from IP addresses that matched our school's network during lunch periods. But I screamed, "Half the school has lunch then!" They weren't listening anymore. 2 officers walked in while Davis was explaining about the cyberbullying campaign and death threats. One officer immediately started handcuffing me while I kept shouting about Tyler needing his insulin. 3:30 now. Tyler would be unlocking our front door, calling out to see if anyone was home. He'd find Dad snoring on the couch, surrounded by empty beer cans. "Different Twitch accounts have different user IDs," I screamed as they dragged me toward the door. "Check the account numbers." But they were already reading me my rights, while Rodriguez told the officers how Marcus was traumatized and afraid to come to school. It drove me past our apartment complex on the way to the station. I could see Tyler's backpack on our front steps, which meant he was inside alone with Dad. My hands were going numb from the handcuffs, but all I could think about was Tyler trying to figure out his insulin dosage while Dad was unconscious. At the police station, they took my phone, wallet, and shoelaces while I kept begging to call someone about Tyler. The desk sergeant said I'd get my call later and pushed me toward booking. They fingerprinted me first, rolling each finger in black ink while I explained about Tyler's diabetes to anyone who'd listen. Then photos against a height chart, holding a number placard while tears ran down my face. I told the booking officer, the fingerprint tech, the photographer, and the medical examiner about Tyler being alone with his insulin. Each person said it wasn't their department and someone else would handle it. The nurse wrote something down when I explained about Dad's drinking problem, but then just filed it away with the rest of my paperwork. They gave me an orange jumpsuit that smelled like bleach and industrial detergent, too big, so the pants dragged on the floor. They put me in a holding cell with 3 other teenagers. One kid was there for vandalism and kept complaining about how this was all his ex-girlfriend's fault for lying to police about him, spray painting her car. Another kid was asleep against the concrete wall, drooling on his orange shirt. The third one asked what I was in for, but I couldn't explain this nightmare without sounding completely insane. Hours crawled by with nothing but fluorescent lights buzzing overhead and the occasional sound of guards walking past our cell. Around 6 p.m., they brought me a sandwich that looked like cardboard with some kind of mystery meat inside, but I couldn't eat anyway. My stomach was twisted in knots thinking about Tyler. By now, Tyler would have been without his insulin for 2 hours. High blood sugar could make him sick, confused, or worse if it went too long. I kept picturing him sitting alone in our living room, checking his glucose meter over and over, trying to remember the math I'd taught him for calculating his dosage. The guard said I'd see a judge in the morning, which meant Tyler had to survive the whole night managing his diabetes alone while Dad was drunk. There was nothing I could do from this cell except imagine Tyler getting sicker and sicker while I was trapped here for something I didn't do. The worst part was knowing that Tyler would be scared to wake Dad up even if he felt really sick, because Dad got violent when interrupted during his drinking binges. I barely slept on the metal bench, just staring at the ceiling tiles and counting them over and over. I kept running through every Twitch stream I'd ever done, trying to figure out who would frame me, who knew enough about Marcus to target him specifically while making it look like I was responsible. The vandalism kid kept talking in his sleep about his ex-girlfriend, mumbling apologies and curse words alternately. Around 2 a.m., one of the guards did a bed check, and I asked him again about calling someone to check on Tyler. He just shrugged and said emergency calls had to go through the duty officer, but the duty officer had gone home hours ago. I explained about Tyler's diabetes and how dangerous it was for him to be alone, but the guard said he'd heard every sob story in the book and wasn't falling for it. Morning came with instant oatmeal that tasted like paste, and a guard telling me my public defender would arrive soon. I asked again about calling someone to check on Tyler, and he just shrugged and said to tell the lawyer. The fluorescent lights never fully turned off, just dimmed to this sickly yellow color that made everything look diseased. Lisa Morgan walked into the meeting room an hour later carrying a beaten-up briefcase and actually looked me in the eyes. She was probably in her 30s, wearing a suit that looked like it came from a thrift store, but she sat down and opened a legal pad. "Tell me everything from the beginning," she said. Her voice was tired but kind, like she'd heard 1,000 stories like mine, but still cared about each one. I explained about Tyler's diabetes and how our dad couldn't help when he was drinking. Then I told her about Twitch user IDs, being unique identifiers that would prove the harasser was a different account than mine. Lisa actually listened and took notes instead of dismissing me like everyone else. She wrote down the technical details about how Twitch works, how the messages calling Marcus different names didn't make sense, how I'd never even talked to him before yesterday. When I told her about Tyler being home alone with his insulin, Lisa immediately pulled out her phone and called Child Protective Services. She put it on speaker so I could hear her report Tyler's situation to a caseworker named Janet Miller. Janet said they'd send someone today for a welfare check. I finally breathed for the first time since yesterday, feeling like someone actually believed me and was taking action. While we waited for the hearing, Lisa explained that CPS would check on Tyler but couldn't remove him without clear evidence of neglect. My stomach twisted because Dad was good at acting sober when authorities showed up. He'd done it before when Tyler's school asked questions about missed days. Dad would splash cold water on his face, chew some gum, and put on his charming act that fooled teachers and social workers every time. Lisa's phone buzzed with an email from the school district. The subject line read, "Emergency expulsion notice. Threat to campus safety." The message said I was permanently banned from school property and that all surrounding districts had been notified about the security risk I posed. My chest tightened reading those words, knowing that my entire educational future was being destroyed based on lies. Lisa took screenshots for our defense file and muttered something about sue happy administrators under her breath. 2 guards came to escort me to the courthouse for my hearing. The judge barely looked up while the prosecutor listed all the harassment evidence they'd found. Lisa argued back that they had no proof linking me to the actual Twitch account doing the harassment, but the judge seemed more interested in his paperwork than listening to our defense. The prosecutor showed printed screenshots and talked about protecting students from online predators while gesturing dramatically toward the evidence table. Lisa stood up and explained about Twitch user IDs being unique identifiers that would prove I wasn't the harasser. But the judge waved her off, saying technical details didn't override a victim's positive identification. His dismissive tone made it clear he'd already made up his mind. When Lisa asked for internet access so I could prove my innocence by showing my real account history, the prosecutor objected immediately. They said I'd use it to delete evidence or contact Marcus directly to intimidate him further. The judge agreed without even considering Lisa's counter-arguments and set my conditions. No internet access, no contact with Marcus or any witnesses, and placement in juvenile detention since my home wasn't considered safe due to Dad's drinking. The guards transported me to Riverside Youth Detention Center, a concrete building surrounded by razor wire fences that looked like something out of a prison movie. Inside, a tired-looking counselor named David Kim handed me a stack of papers while explaining the rules about wake-up times, meals, group therapy, and phone privileges. His voice had that flat, bureaucratic tone of someone who'd given the same speech thousands of times. I asked David if I could call my friend Connor, who might help prove my innocence, and David said he'd consider it after reviewing my case file. He showed me to a small room with bunk beds, one already occupied by another kid's belongings, comic books, a few photos, and a teddy bear that looked well-loved. The walls were painted that institutional beige color that somehow managed to be depressing even in good lighting. After dinner in a cafeteria with 15 other detained kids, David called me to his office and approved one supervised call to Connor. The phone was an old landline with a coiled cord that barely reached the chair. I dialed with shaking fingers, and when Connor answered, I quickly explained everything. Connor sounded shocked and immediately promised to help however he could. He said he'd screenshot everything showing I'd been TechWizard 2019 on Twitch since 2019 with consistent streaming history that proved my account was real. That evening, David called me over and said Janet Miller from CPS had called with an update. She'd visited our apartment and found Tyler managing his insulin alone while Dad was passed out drunk in the bedroom. Tyler was okay, but scared and hadn't been eating properly because he was worried about calculating his dosages wrong. The image of my little brother sitting alone in our messy kitchen, afraid to eat because he might get his insulin wrong, made me want to punch something. Janet said they were placing Tyler in emergency foster care until Dad could get into a treatment program. I wanted to cry with relief that Tyler was safe, but also felt terrible that he'd lost everything familiar. His room, his toys, his school friends, his routine. David saw my face and explained that Tyler's foster family had experience with diabetic kids and lived close enough for him to stay in his same school. At least that was something. The next morning, Lisa showed up with a briefcase full of legal documents. She spread discovery requests across the meeting room table, explaining we needed to force Twitch to provide the real account data that would prove my innocence. The user ID numbers would show definitively that the harasser used a different account than mine, since Twitch's system made duplicate user IDs technically impossible. Lisa said Twitch would probably fight the subpoena since they protected user privacy fiercely, but we had to try anyway. She also filed requests for the school's network logs, which would show exactly which device sent the harassment messages during lunch periods. The technical evidence would prove someone else was using the school network to frame me, assuming the school hadn't already deleted the logs to cover their tracks. After Lisa left, I spent hours in my cell writing down every detail I could remember about the screenshots they'd shown me. I filled pages with observations about the writing style that didn't match how I talked, the mentions of Marcus's family members I'd never heard of, the references to his old school in Ohio that I'd never been to. I wrote down how the harasser seemed to know Marcus's class schedule from his previous school, teachers' names I'd never heard, and details about his family that only someone from his past would know. 2 days later, David showed me Lisa's text with screenshots from Connor. My Twitch account clearly showed TechWizard scored 2019 with consistent streaming since 2019, plus chat logs with Connor and other friends going back years. Connor had also gotten statements from regular viewers who remembered me streaming during some of the times the harassment messages were sent. The evidence was mounting that I couldn't be in 2 places at once. A detective named Officer Sarah Chen came to interview me at the detention center. Unlike everyone else who'd already decided I was guilty, she actually pulled out a notepad when I started explaining how Twitch user IDs worked. She asked specific questions about the technical details and wrote down that user IDs were unique identifiers that couldn't be duplicated across the platform. Her professionalism gave me the first real hope I'd felt since this nightmare started. Detective Chen said she'd verify this information with their cybercrime unit and seemed genuinely interested when I explained that the harasser's messages showed knowledge about Marcus's life in Ohio that I couldn't possibly have. She took photos of all my handwritten notes and said she'd review them carefully. For the first time, I felt like someone in law enforcement was actually investigating instead of just building a case against me. The next day, Lisa called the detention center with an update. She'd filed an emergency motion asking the court to order the school to preserve their network logs before they automatically deleted after 30 days. The school's lawyer had opposed it, claiming it was a fishing expedition that would violate other students' privacy. But the judge scheduled a hearing to decide whether the logs were critical evidence that could prove my innocence. 2 days later, Janet Miller called to tell me about Tyler's adjustment to foster care. He was doing well with managing his diabetes and had made friends with the foster family's son, who was also 12. Tyler was asking about me every day and couldn't wait to see me again. Janet said we could have a supervised visit next week if Tyler's foster parents agreed. Hearing that Tyler was safe and making friends lifted a weight off my chest that I hadn't realized was there. Lisa returned with a thick folder from the school district after the judge ordered them to preserve their network logs. The IT report showed the harassment messages definitely came from the school's IP address during lunch periods, but over 150 students had lunch then. The logs didn't show which specific device sent them, just that they came from somewhere on campus during those time windows. It was evidence, but not the smoking gun we needed. I was looking through the screenshots again when something clicked in my brain. The harasser had mentioned Mr. Peterson's geometry class using an A-B day schedule, but our school had switched to block scheduling 2 years ago. Marcus only transferred here last year from Ohio, so he never experienced the old schedule system. This proved someone from Marcus's old school was involved, someone who remembered how his previous school operated. Lisa's eyes got wide when I explained this discovery. She started writing notes frantically about how this showed the real harasser knew details about Marcus's previous school that I couldn't possibly know. We had concrete evidence pointing to someone from his past following him here, someone with intimate knowledge of his previous educational environment. That afternoon, David handed me the detention center phone to look at something Lisa had texted him. Screenshots from social media showed my school photo edited with Predator written across it in red letters. Someone had posted it everywhere saying I was a dangerous cyberbully who threatened to kill students. Hundreds of people were sharing it and commenting horrible things about me. I scrolled through comment after comment calling me sick, saying I should be locked up forever, hoping I'd get beaten up in detention. Random strangers were calling for my address to be posted online, saying I deserved whatever happened to me. The anger built up so fast I couldn't control it. Before I knew what I was doing, I threw the phone across the room hard enough to crack the screen. David grabbed my arm and made me sit down while he called for backup to make sure I wasn't going to hurt myself or anyone else. 3 days later, Connor showed up during visiting hours carrying a folder of printed papers. He'd spent days going through our gaming history and found proof I was definitely online playing other games at the exact time some of the harassment messages were sent. He'd reached out to other players who remembered gaming with me during those sessions, collecting witness statements from people across multiple time zones. Connor had screenshots of match results with timestamps plus messages from 6 different gamers confirming I was playing with them when the harassment was supposedly happening. Lisa said it wasn't absolute proof since someone could claim I was gaming while also sending messages on another device. But it was more evidence showing the timeline didn't match up with the prosecution's theory. That weekend, Lisa picked me up to watch a live stream of an emergency school board meeting about student safety. Parents packed the auditorium, demanding to know how a dangerous predator was allowed in school with their children. One mom stood up crying about how her daughter was terrified to return to school, knowing a stalker had been sitting in classrooms with innocent kids. Another dad said, "I should be banned from all schools permanently and monitored for the rest of my life." The board members nodded along and promised they were taking every measure to ensure student safety, basically agreeing I was guilty without saying it directly. They talked about implementing new threat assessment protocols and increased security monitoring, using my case as justification for turning the school into more of a prison environment. Lisa was typing notes about defamation and how we could sue them later for destroying my reputation without evidence. Detective Chen called Lisa's phone the next day and put it on speaker so I could hear. She'd gotten preliminary information from Twitch's legal team confirming that user IDs were unique identifiers that couldn't be duplicated across the platform. She'd issued a detailed subpoena asking for the full account information for both TechWizard 2019 accounts, mine, and whatever user ID the harasser actually used. Finally, we'd get technical proof that would clear my name. 2 days later, Lisa brought a new person to the detention center, a digital forensics expert named Alex Torres, who specialized in cybercrime investigations. Alex pulled out his laptop and started explaining things even Detective Chen hadn't considered, like how someone could spoof device identifiers to make harassment look like it came from a different computer than it actually did. Alex showed us how the school's guest network had minimal security, so anyone with basic tech knowledge could hide their real identity while making it look like someone else sent the messages. He said he'd seen cases where cyberbullies deliberately picked usernames similar to other people's to frame them if they got caught. The technical sophistication required suggested this wasn't just random bullying, but a calculated attack. While Alex was explaining the technical stuff, I suddenly remembered another detail from those screenshots. The harassment had mentioned Mrs. Rodriguez's Spanish class and Mr. Johnson's history class, but those were teachers at Marcus's old school in Ohio. I'd never heard those names before seeing the messages, and there was no way I could have known about teachers from a school I'd never attended. Lisa got excited and had Alex start documenting this in his technical report. This was concrete proof. It would be impossible for me to know about teachers from a school I'd never attended in a state I'd never visited. Alex said this was the kind of specific detail that could prove someone from Marcus's past was the real harasser, someone with inside knowledge of his previous school environment. A week later, Janet Miller called Lisa to report on Tyler's welfare check results. Tyler was thriving in foster care and had told his social worker that Dad had been drinking every day for months. He'd been managing his own insulin most of the time, because Dad was usually too drunk to help calculate dosages or remember meal timing. Janet said they were opening a full investigation into our home situation, and Dad would need to complete an inpatient treatment program before Tyler could return home. The next morning, Detective Chen called Lisa with news that made her actually excited for the first time since taking my case. She'd been analyzing the harassment messages and noticed the oldest ones came from IP addresses in Ohio from 4 months ago. These messages happened before Marcus even moved to our state, which meant someone from his old life was doing this, not some random kid from his new school. Lisa immediately called me at the detention center to share the news. Detective Chen was finally taking the technical evidence seriously and had started mapping out when each threat came from where. She found a clear pattern where the Ohio messages stopped right when Marcus moved here, then started again from our school network. This meant the harasser had either followed Marcus here physically or had someone helping them locally. 2 days later, Janet called to update me about Dad's situation. Dad had been arrested for child endangerment after Tyler's medical records showed he'd been to the emergency room twice for diabetic emergencies when Dad was too drunk to help. Dad was in jail pending his court date and would need to complete an inpatient treatment program before he could even request supervised visitation with Tyler. At least, Tyler was safe now. I felt relief that Tyler was protected, but also worried about what would happen to our family long term. Janet said Tyler was asking about me constantly and wanted to know when he could see me. She scheduled a supervised visit for the following week at the CPS office downtown, which would be the first time I'd seen my brother since this nightmare started. 3 days later, Alex had been working on tracing the harasser's Twitch account and found something huge. The account was created using an email address registered to Riverside High School in Columbus, Ohio, Marcus's old school. The email had been created just 1 week after Marcus transferred to our school here, suggesting someone had specifically targeted him after learning about his move. Alex tracked the creation timeline and found that someone at Marcus's old school had specifically created the TechWizard 2019 account to frame me after learning Marcus was being bullied again at his new school. The technical evidence proved I couldn't have created that account since I'd never been to Ohio and already had my real account for years before the fake one was even made. Lisa took all this evidence and filed a motion with the court requesting my immediate release. She argued that the mounting evidence clearly showed I was innocent, and keeping me detained was violating my constitutional rights. The judge reviewed everything and agreed to schedule a hearing the following week to consider whether I should be released pending further investigation. Detective Chen went to interview Marcus again with all the new evidence about Ohio connections. Marcus sat there looking at the IP address logs and email records and finally admitted something important. He said there was a kid named Brett Sullivan at his old school who'd bullied him mercilessly for months before he transferred. Brett had made specific threats about following Marcus wherever he went and making his life miserable, no matter where he tried to hide. Marcus started crying and said he'd been so scared when he heard my username that he just panicked and assumed it was me continuing the harassment. The detective showed him the technical evidence proving the real harasser was someone from Ohio with access to his old school's email system. And Marcus broke down completely. He said Brett was obsessed with making his life hell and had threatened to destroy him when Marcus's family decided to move across state lines to escape the bullying. The next day, Detective Chen contacted Columbus police about Brett Sullivan. They found his social media accounts full of angry posts about Marcus, running away like a coward and promises to make him pay for leaving. Brett's Discord and gaming accounts showed a pattern of creating fake identities to harass people who'd crossed him, including other students who transferred away from their school. Meanwhile, I was finally allowed a supervised visit with Tyler at the CPS office. When I walked into that small room with toys scattered around, Tyler jumped up from the plastic chair and ran straight into my arms, crying so hard his whole body shook. He kept saying my name over and over while I held him tight, feeling how much weight he'd lost during our separation. Tyler told me about his foster family's cat and how he was learning to cook simple meals for himself with supervision. He was proud that he'd been managing his insulin perfectly with the foster parents' help and had even taught their son how to recognize the signs of low blood sugar. When our hour was up, he grabbed onto my shirt and wouldn't let go until the social worker gently pulled him away, promising we'd see each other again soon. 2 days later, Lisa called with the news that changed everything. Columbus police had arrested Brett Sullivan after finding evidence on his computer showing he'd created multiple fake accounts to harass Marcus across various platforms. Brett had admitted to using the school network when he visited his cousin, who went to the community college near our high school. The cousin had been completely unaware of what Brett was doing with the network access. Brett's cousin had unknowingly given him guest network access several times when Brett claimed he was visiting family and needed internet for college applications. The cousin played basketball at our school's courts every Tuesday and Thursday and had alumni privileges that Brett had exploited to access our school's network. Technical analysis of Brett's devices showed exact matches with the harassment timestamps, proving he was the real perpetrator. The district attorney's office reviewed all the new evidence and decided to drop all charges against me immediately. Lisa said they'd formally declined prosecution and recommended expunging my arrest record completely. The prosecutor admitted privately that they should have investigated more thoroughly before arresting a minor, but they'd never put that admission in writing for liability reasons. Principal Thompson and Assistant Principal Davis refused to acknowledge they'd been wrong about anything. They released a statement saying they'd followed proper protocols for handling threats and stood by their decision to involve law enforcement immediately. The school board backed them up completely, claiming student safety had to come first, and they'd acted appropriately based on the information available at the time. 3 days later, Brett got arrested in Ohio on federal charges for cyberstalking across state lines. The FBI got involved because he'd used internet services to threaten someone in another state, making it a federal crime. Marcus had to provide a victim impact statement about how the harassment had terrorized him and made him suspect innocent people like me, destroying his ability to trust anyone at his new school. Marcus wrote about the constant fear of being followed, not trusting anyone at his new school, and feeling crushing guilt that an innocent person got arrested because of his panicked identification. He apologized directly to me through Lisa, saying he never meant for me to get hurt, but was so traumatized by months of bullying that he couldn't think clearly when he heard my username. A month passed before the court approved my release from detention and allowed me to return home. The apartment felt empty without Tyler there, but Janet said he could have overnight visits once I proved I could provide a stable environment for him. Dad was still in treatment and wouldn't be released for another 6 months minimum, assuming he completed the program successfully. I went back to school on a Monday morning, and it was exactly as awful as I expected. Half the kids still thought I was guilty and moved away when I walked by them in the hallways. Teachers looked at me suspiciously during class and called on me less frequently than other students. Connor met me at my locker and walked with me everywhere, sitting with me at lunch when no one else would come near our table. A few kids gradually started talking to me again after Connor explained all the evidence proving I was innocent and showed them news articles about Brett's arrest. Then one day between classes, Marcus walked up to me in the hallway while everyone watched. He said he was sorry for identifying me wrong, that the trauma made him see threats everywhere and panic when he heard my username in chemistry class. I told him it wasn't his fault, that Brett was good at manipulation and targeting vulnerable people who were already scared. Marcus nodded and said he hoped I could forgive him someday for the nightmare he'd accidentally put me through. We shook hands while everyone stared, and slowly the whispers died down as word spread that the real perpetrator had been caught. That same week, Brett took a plea deal to avoid trial, getting 3 years in federal prison, plus 5 years probation with complete internet restriction and mandatory psychological counseling. Detective Chen called Lisa to let us know Brett's cousin wouldn't face charges, since he was basically just a victim who didn't know what Brett was really doing with the network access he'd provided. Lisa started working on expunging my arrest record, explaining it could take months of paperwork, but should eventually clear my name legally, so this wouldn't follow me to college or job applications. She'd become more than just my lawyer by then. She was someone who believed me when everyone else wanted to throw me away, who fought for me when the system had already decided I was guilty. Meanwhile, Tyler was doing amazingly well in foster care and had started asking about when he could come home permanently. Janet said once Dad completed treatment and I turned 18, we could petition for custody of Tyler together. Tyler's diabetes was perfectly controlled now with consistent care, and he'd made honor roll at his new school for the first time in years. 6 months later, Dad graduated from his treatment program and started attending AA meetings daily. He got a job at a warehouse loading trucks and moved into a sober living facility where he'd be monitored for another year. Janet allowed supervised visits with Tyler, who was nervous but willing to give Dad a chance if he stayed sober and continued therapy. I graduated high school with barely passing grades since I'd missed so much school during everything, but Connor was there, cheering from the audience, along with Lisa and even Detective Chen, who'd driven down just to see me graduate. Several state colleges accepted me, despite my grades, after Lisa wrote detailed letters explaining the circumstances and providing documentation of my eventual vindication. Tyler's foster family threw him a going-away party when the court approved him moving back with me the week before I left for college. We'd found a small apartment near campus where Tyler could stay with me during school breaks and summers while continuing his relationship with his foster family, who'd become like extended family to both of us. The day before I left for college, Tyler and I were packing boxes when he said he wanted to study computer science like me when he grew up, maybe even work in cybersecurity to help catch people like Brett. I told him he was smart enough to do anything he wanted and that I'd always be there to help him figure things out. We went to get pizza at our favorite place, and I knew we were both going to make it through this stronger than before. Brett served his full sentence and moved across the country when he got out, supposedly to live with relatives and start fresh somewhere nobody knew his history. Marcus graduated valedictorian and went to college on a full scholarship, becoming an advocate for cyberbullying victims and helping other students who'd been falsely accused. Connor and I stayed friends throughout college, and he was the best man at my wedding 5 years later. Dad completed his second year of sobriety and moved into his own apartment 6 blocks away from Tyler and me. Their relationship was still rocky, but Tyler was willing to have dinner with him once a week as long as Dad stayed in therapy and continued attending meetings. Some wounds take longer to heal than others, but at least Tyler felt safe now. The school district eventually settled a lawsuit we filed for violating my due process rights, though they never admitted wrongdoing. They used the settlement money to establish a fund for other students who'd been falsely accused, and they implemented new protocols requiring actual investigation before involving law enforcement in student disputes. The first year of college was rough academically since I'd missed so much high school, but I was determined to catch up. I spent countless hours in the library and tutoring centers, slowly building back the knowledge I'd lost during those crucial months of detention and legal battles. My professors were understanding when I explained my situation, and several offered extra office hours to help me succeed. Tyler visited me every other weekend, and watching him thrive gave me motivation to keep pushing forward. He'd grown 3 inches taller, and his confidence had improved dramatically since living in a stable environment. His diabetes management had become second nature, and he was even considering becoming a pediatric endocrinologist to help other kids with type 1 diabetes. During my sophomore year, I started volunteering with the campus legal aid clinic, helping other students who'd been falsely accused of various infractions. Lisa had taught me so much about fighting for justice that I wanted to pay it forward. I helped a freshman who'd been accused of plagiarism when his professor didn't understand how collaborative coding worked, and assisted another student who'd been wrongly blamed for a dormitory fire. The work was emotionally draining, but incredibly rewarding. Each case reminded me how easily the system could fail innocent people, especially young adults who didn't know their rights or couldn't afford proper legal representation. I became known on campus as someone who would listen without judgment and fight for the truth, no matter how complicated the situation seemed. In my junior year, I was contacted by a documentary filmmaker who wanted to tell my story as part of a series about cyberbullying and false accusations. At first, I was hesitant to relive those traumatic months, but Tyler convinced me that sharing our experience might help prevent other families from going through the same nightmare. The filming process took several months and included interviews with Lisa, Detective Chen, Connor, and even Marcus, who had become a close friend by then. Marcus had started his own nonprofit organization helping victims of cyberbullying, and we often spoke at conferences together about the importance of proper investigation before rushing to judgment. During the documentary production, we learned that Brett had actually targeted 3 other students from his old school before focusing on Marcus. 2 families had never reported the harassment because they were afraid of being blamed, and 1 student had transferred schools without ever identifying the real perpetrator. And our case had broken open a pattern of abuse that had been going on for years. The documentary premiered at several film festivals and eventually aired on a major streaming platform. The response was overwhelming. Hundreds of people reached out to share their own stories of false accusations, wrongful arrests, and systemic failures. Many were inspired to fight back against injustice in their own communities. Tyler was now 16 and had become something of a minor celebrity at his high school for his advocacy work with diabetic students. He'd started a support group for kids managing chronic illnesses and was being recruited by several colleges for both his academic achievements and his community service. Dad had been sober for over 3 years, and they'd rebuilt a cautious but genuine relationship. During my senior year, I was offered internships at several cybersecurity firms that had seen the documentary and were impressed by my technical knowledge and personal resilience. I chose a company in Seattle that specialized in digital forensics and helping law enforcement investigate cybercrimes properly. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd ended up in the exact field that could have prevented my false accusation if the proper protocols had been followed from the beginning. My first case involved helping clear a teenager who'd been accused of hacking his school's grading system when it was actually a security vulnerability that any student could have accidentally triggered. Graduation day was surreal. As I walked across the stage to receive my computer science degree, I thought about that terrified 17-year-old sitting in Principal Thompson's office, begging them to check Discord tag numbers. Tyler was in the audience cheering loudly, along with Lisa, Detective Chen, Connor, and even Dad, who'd driven up from his sober living facility for the ceremony. After graduation, I moved to Seattle and started my career in digital forensics. Tyler decided to attend the University of Washington to stay close to me, and we found a small house near campus where he could live while studying pre-med. Our bond had only grown stronger through everything we'd survived together. 3 years into my career, I was promoted to lead a new unit focused specifically on preventing false accusations in cybercrime cases. We developed training protocols for schools, law enforcement, and prosecutors about the importance of technical verification before making arrests. The program was eventually adopted by 12 states and helped prevent dozens of wrongful prosecutions. Connor had become a software engineer at a gaming company and remained my closest friend. He was the best man at my wedding to Sarah, a fellow cybersecurity expert I'd met at a conference. Sarah had her own story of overcoming injustice. She'd been discriminated against in the tech industry for years before finding a company that valued her brilliant analytical mind. Tyler graduated summa cum laude from medical school and matched into a pediatric endocrinology residency at Boston Children's Hospital. During his graduation speech, he talked about how his experience with diabetes and our family's legal struggles had taught him the importance of advocating for vulnerable patients who couldn't advocate for themselves. Dad celebrated 5 years of sobriety by opening a small auto repair shop. He and Tyler had rebuilt their relationship slowly with lots of therapy and honest conversations about the past. They still had dinner together every Sunday when Tyler was in town, and Dad had become a mentor to other fathers struggling with addiction. Lisa had been promoted to chief public defender and continued fighting for wrongfully accused clients. She sent me updates on particularly challenging cases, and I often provided technical expertise pro bono to help prove innocence. She'd become like family to us, someone who'd stood by us when it felt like the entire world was against us. Detective Chen had been promoted to head the cybercrime unit and implemented new training requirements for investigating online harassment cases. She often used my case as an example of what not to do during police academy lectures, emphasizing the importance of technical verification over victim identification alone. Marcus finished his PhD in psychology and expanded his nonprofit to provide free counseling services for victims of cyberbullying and false accusations. We spoke at conferences together several times a year, sharing our story and advocating for better investigation protocols. He'd become one of my closest friends, and our shared experience had created an unbreakable bond. The school district that had expelled me eventually faced multiple lawsuits for their handling of various student cases. Principal Thompson and Assistant Principal Davis were both forced to resign after a federal investigation found systematic violations of students' due process rights. The district implemented comprehensive reform measures and hired new leadership committed to proper investigation procedures. Brett completed his prison sentence and disappeared from public view. According to his parole officer, he'd moved to a rural area and worked in construction while attending mandatory counseling sessions. Marcus and I both hoped he'd found a way to channel his technical skills into something positive rather than destructive. On the 10th anniversary of my false accusation, Tyler and I started a nonprofit foundation dedicated to helping families navigate wrongful prosecution cases. We provided funding for legal defense, connected families with experienced attorneys like Lisa, and offered technical expertise to prove innocence in cybercrime cases. The foundation's first major case involved a 14-year-old girl in Texas who'd been accused of cyberstalking a classmate when she was actually the victim of an elaborate framing scheme. Using the investigation techniques I'd learned over the years, we were able to identify the real perpetrator and clear her name before she spent even one night in detention. Looking back on everything that happened, I realized that nightmare experience shaped me into someone who fights for justice and protects the innocent. Tyler often says that going through hell together made us stronger than we ever could have been separately. Our family was broken and rebuilt, scarred but ultimately more resilient. The trauma never fully goes away. Sometimes I still wake up from dreams about sitting in that detention cell, worried about Tyler managing his diabetes alone, but those memories have also driven me to ensure that other families don't have to endure what we survived. Sarah and I now have 2 young children of our own, and Tyler is their favorite uncle who teaches them about science and standing up for what's right. Dad is a doting grandfather who takes his sobriety seriously because he knows how much his family means to him. The house where Tyler and I lived through Dad's worst drinking days has been torn down and replaced with a small park. Sometimes when I'm visiting town, I drive by and remember that scared kid who almost lost everything because adults rushed to judgment instead of seeking the truth. If there's one thing I want people to take away from my story, it's this. The truth matters more than convenience, and technical evidence matters more than emotional reactions. Too many innocent people suffer because investigators take shortcuts or make assumptions based on fear rather than facts. Connor still jokes that I'm the only person he knows who turned a false cyberbullying accusation into a career catching real cyberbullies. But there's nothing funny about how many families are destroyed by rushed investigations and systemic failures to protect the innocent. Tyler is now Dr. Tyler Chen at Boston Children's Hospital, and he credits our experience with teaching him to always advocate for his young patients, especially when other adults aren't listening to them. He's published research on managing diabetes in traumatic situations and speaks regularly about the intersection of medical care and social justice. Thanks for reading my story. Sometimes the system fails innocent people, but the truth has a way of coming out eventually if you don't give up fighting for it. The key is having people who believe in you and refuse to let injustice have the final word. If you made it to the end, I appreciate you taking the time to hear what really happened to me and my family, and I hope it inspires you to fight for truth and justice in your own community.